And thanks to, first of all, thanks to Patty for having organized to put together here today. From, I think, a very far distance, so thank you for doing that. And of course to the McCain team, certainly with Brett and her team, for having us today. So what we're going to be talking about is regional efforts for tertiary providers. We've got an exciting panel. We're not going to go through all the introductions. Folks online, if you don't know who everybody is, you get a chance to go online and read it, which will make me very happy because we get the site. So, first of all, just for, we'll go down the line to talk to everybody, but just a question. We want to make sure we're engaging with all of you. So ask questions if you're online, send questions in, and we'll have conversations between the panelists as well, okay? And we'll use our hour. So we'll go down the line. So Ben will be first. And the question that we're going to be talking about and some of the questions that follow, the main question is, how do the organization actively build or participate in targeted violence prevention, where participants know what the services are available in other disciplines and how to contact them for help. So that's our main topic. It would be so kind of stuff. Sure.
Hi everyone, my name is Ben Gardner. I'm the director of the Office of Counterterrorism in New York State. I will freely admit that I've come to the States a little later in life, and really it was a series of mass shootings over the last few years that got me engaged in the issue as the director of the Office of Counterterrorism, recognizing that domestic violent extremism, racially motivated violent extremism, anti-government violent extremism was very much on the rise. While we saw kind of foreign terrorist organization motivated terrorism decline, realized that we needed to develop policy solutions to the domestic threat we were seeing. Then the mass shooting in Buffalo occurred, and that really galvanized a lot of interest and effort from both the part of the executive, part of the legislature, and part of stakeholders in the state to really put resources and energy behind confronting domestic terrorism and targeted violence. We're taking kind of a three-pronged approach to addressing this threat. The first and I think probably the most innovative is that we are requiring counties to develop domestic terrorism plans. The focal point of those domestic terrorism plans are the development of threat assessment and management teams, which I'm assuming most of the people in this room are familiar with. Before we started the initiative, I think there were 3 in the state that were being piloted with funding provided by DHS, which we're grateful for, obviously. Since we started this initiative in July, August timeframe, held a summit for the state. We provided training to stakeholders. We've gone from 3 in the state to 31, which tells me a couple things, right? One is there's generally interest in this as a potential solution to targeted violence and domestic terrorism. The other, and this is a little more sensitive, is that it can be an apolitical solution. New York State is, in spite of what some may think, a very politically diverse state. As soon as you get north of New York City, there's a lot of political diversity, which means for a solution to take hold, it really has to be an apolitical solution. And a lot of our messaging has been focused on the idea that, kind of a restorative approach to people who I say become dislocated from their community, from their society at large. It's ideologically agnostic, right? Why they've broken away, what motivates them towards violence isn't the point. The point is that they are motivated towards violence, and that's what we start to confront. We provided trainings to our local counterparts on how to create TAM teams, but we're very focused on allowing those TAM teams to represent the community that they're in, and we're providing guidance, but at the same time, we recognize that a TAM team that will be successful in, Suffolk County on Long Island, which has a population of 2.5 million people, is going to look incredibly different than the TAM team that's created in Hamilton County, Adirondacks that has a population of 5,000 people. There can be different resources, there can be different stakeholders. So we want to support the local government's ability to create those. We've also been very lucky in having an excellent, credible messenger in the Monroe County Sheriff Baxter, who is sort of the, OG of FAM teams in New York State and has been really a great partner, proactive about going out and proselytizing. He brings credibility because he's law enforcement, but also because he recognizes that law enforcement has to stopgap and not the first solution. Like the message we've been putting out is if we get to a law enforcement solution, we fail before that. The other thing we're really focused on is providing training to local stakeholders, and that goes beyond government stakeholders. There's going to be a wide range of training, everything from target hardening to recognizing the indicators of radicalization and mobilization violence. But I really want to go with the program, and this is an analogy that some people in here heard, is, on September 12th, 2001, nobody knew what see something, say something was. Now everybody knows what that means. There's an equivalent for recognizing when your family member, your neighbor, your coworker is in the process of radicalization and understanding what to do about that. And that's something that when I say we, I really mean all the people in this room, need to figure out, need to develop, and then need to start hammering on getting that message out. So that's really the local point of the training that we want to develop. And then finally, we're working with a vendor who will, until we close the contract, unfortunately, I cannot use his name. You probably all know this vendor. They may represent the room right now. But working with them on really developing online off-ramps for people who are in the process of radicalizing online. Obviously, there's a history of radicalizing online, but I think post-COVID, a lot of people just fell down deep dark holes online as they were staying kind of disconnected from the rest of society. And we're starting to see the consequences of that in the very strange ideologies that are motivating acts of mass violence. So with that, I think probably have time. I can turn it over, and thank you very much.
Hi everyone. Sorry, go ahead. Hi everyone, my name is Courtney Tossian. I oversee all of our first responder crisis intervention programs for the city of Aurora, Colorado. Within that, we have our targeted violence prevention program that utilizes the public health model, a pre-criminal intervention approach, what we really emphasize there. I'll talk about two different programs today, one being the Colorado Preventing Targeted Violence Program that's run by McKenna Jensen, who wishes she could be here, but she is on maternity leave, so didn't want to bother her. And then our Aurora Police Deterrence Program. So for us, actively participating in the community is huge. So one of our main lines of effort with our Colorado Preventing Targeted Violence Program is that outreach and reaching those rural communities who don't have access to these resources and might not have even heard of what this is. So McKenna Jensen and her team, and there's actually a lot of the founding members of the COPTV team in this room today. So I advise you to reach out to Sandy Wicks, Dr. Nielsen, and Dr. John Nicoletti as well. Very nice number. And they also would have a lot of information for you, but bringing that group together has been really powerful because every one of those people and the additional people on that board have a lot of connections in this space, and just as well as the people who are vulnerable or semi-vulnerable to being victims of targeted violence. So having that group brought in a lot of different people. And with that, the COPTV program created a website that has information about the different practitioners in the area, the different groups that offer prevention services, whether it's primary, secondary, or tertiary. And it's been a really helpful database and different way of getting that information across. Now, in Aurora's program, outreach is an additional line of effort for us as well. We operate on 3 lines of effort: direct intervention, community outreach, and education. So we align very closely with the COPTV program in that that's kind of what all the work is about there. So bringing those educational moments and those educational programs and trainings to the different people who might not have access to these has actually been really great in terms of networking and getting the word out, not only about what targeted violence is and how to prevent targeted violence through these different lines of effort, but it also gives us this network of professionals to reach out to and refer to. Yeah, for us, it was just all the different events that we've seen in Colorado and just across the country. We created the Targeted Violence Prevention Program in 2020, and that's a multidisciplinary group, so it's a mental health professional and officer, and Sammy Weiss was actually my counterpart on that program, so you know him, you know how amazing he is in connecting people, and it's just overall knowledge within this space, so can't recommend talking to Sammy enough if you want to know more about this kind of group. The same with McKenna Jensen, they are phenomenal to reach out to. Yeah.
I have one. Aloha. My name is Patty Kickel, and I'm a program manager with the Hawaii State Fusion Center. And really looking at violence prevention programs and networking, this is a big example. What happened, we all work together in various ways outside of this room, right? Because we have Heidi, who works with Boston Children's Hospital, contacted me once because they were doing some research into programs going on in other jurisdictions. And then Courtney, I just met Courtney recently because mainly I was working with McKenna from Colorado, who had given an introductory spiel to a group I was working on in Hawaii to build our targeted violence prevention strategy. Colorado had come to give us a presentation on their program. And then for Ben, we worked with New York because our targeted violence prevention strategy development team was working along the same lines as New York at the same time, working on the same things. In addition to that, Hawaii has worked with ROCTAC, right? Rochester Threat Assessment, right? The super enthusiastic people. Yes, so Fusion Centers work with ROCTAC, Fusion Center work with Kayak, Fusion Centers work with all different areas throughout the nation. And that's kind of the point that I want to drive home today as we're on this panel, is that we're all doing kind of the same work. And once we connect with each other, it kind of multiplies the force. So our program in Hawaii is kind of the same thing, just concentrating on our 8 islands. Sometimes people say 9 because people travel to Las Vegas so much. It's called the 9th island. But yeah, we have 8 islands. And to give you some perspective, we have Niihau, which is the Forbidden Island. We have Hawaii, which has never been conquered. When Kamehameha the Great brought together the islands, Hawaii decided that they would cooperate, but they were never conquered. We have Oahu, which is pretty much an urban core, different from all the other islands. We have Big Island, where volcano in the process of erupting, but when you go to the rural areas there, you don't just walk into the rural areas. You have to be respectful, know the different cultures. And so all of that, how do we get people statewide to work together to prevent violence? Ben had made a really good point about this effort being apolitical. And so what we do in Hawaii is that although it's important to understand violent extremism and to understand various ideologies, we concentrate on the underpinnings of violence, of getting ready to commit violence. And so we concentrate on things like real personalities or isolation or depression or financial housing, other resource problems that people are facing. And that's how we've really been able to loop in all the people in our community, so that when we usually think of domestic terrorism, counter-violent extremism being associated with law enforcement, what we've done in Hawaii is we brought in the social workers and said people who are going to commit violence are suffering from lack of housing, lack of food security. Guess who helps them? It's the social workers. Social workers prevent violence. People suffering from mental wellness issues or mental illness. Guess who helps them? It's the counselors, it's the psychologists. You prevent targeted violence. So reaching out to the community, seeing what people already do in their lives, helping them understand the pathway to violence and how they can help to disrupt people along that pathway, and then looping them in not only us getting to know them and giving them some information on what we know of domestic violence, extremism, and so forth, but getting them to talk to each other. That's why I'm really happy we have this panel, and why I'm really happy we have the prevention network.
Great, thank you, and I'm still hoping for an invitation to come visit you in Hawaii. I'm Heidi Ellis. I'm at Boston Children's Hospital. And I'm going to talk about our effort there. And what I'm going to need you to do is visualize two circles that are sort of connected and then a network of like stars all around it. So when I was coming here, I was like, I don't have a PowerPoint. I'm addicted to PowerPoint. How am I going to illustrate this? And then I got here and I'm like, oh my gosh, look at the two P's. So just use that part of the PowerPoint where there's two intersecting circles and then a network of dots as I explain our program. And I'm going to talk about things that work, and then I'm going to talk about an idea that didn't work, because I think it's really important that we pay attention. I think Sammy said this earlier, pay attention to what's not working as well as to what's working, so that we can make sure we get it better and more right as we move forward. So in Massachusetts area, there's a 4-state region where the FBI convenes, and I say convene because they don't run it or own it, but they convene a multidisciplinary threat assessment team called the Mass Bay Threat Assessment Team. And that's a multidisciplinary group that brings that diverse thinking to cases that are presented on the team and tries to bring in psychosocial support, health, case management when that's appropriate, and kind of point people towards some of those alternatives. Our team, based at Children's Hospital, does work with youth, as the name would suggest. We've been particularly focused on this idea of where's the M in a threat assessment and management team? Who is in charge of the M? Because in my experience, it's extremely difficult to engage some of these families. Often these are families who have a deep distrust of systems, sometimes based in very difficult circumstances that they've been through in the past. These kids may be coming from families where if it was all working, they wouldn't be there. And so there's a lot of dysfunction, and parents aren't able to advocate for their kids in the way that we need to if we're going to get our kids into services these days. So we built at Children's Hospital with support from initially just as a little sort of pilot program, and then with funding from the CP3 program, a multidisciplinary services team. So we can then take the first circle is the threat assessment team. The second circle is our multidisciplinary team, where we take referrals from the mass-based threat assessment team for youth who are radicalizing towards terrorism and targeted violence. Then our role there, and by our, I really mean Lola, who if you haven't met her, she's amazing, she's out there. The role from there is to try to understand strengths, risks, needs, what can we wrap around a youth to help manage some of the stressors and challenges they may be experiencing and build back in some of the positive connections that they may be missing. Here's where I get to the part that didn't work. We had this great idea on paper that youth would come in, Lola would do an assessment, she'd figure it all out, then she'd refer them to their community, and we'd have providers who were in their own communities where we could then support the providers, capacity build, more on that coming later, thanks to Emma. But the idea would be that we would establish a sort of network of providers around the region who could take on these cases, build their understanding and capacity with some additional support when needed, and then continue working with these families. What we were wondering about is that it's really not as easy as a transitive property of trust. Someone comes in and starts working with our program. Engagement sometimes takes 6 months. Getting from the actual signing of consent forms to a kid actually talking, another 6 months. So at that point, after a year of careful trust building, the idea of passing someone off through a referral was pointless. It wasn't going to take. So I think what I want to bring to the conversation here is not a solution. I'm hoping like, some years down the road, I'll sit here and say, this is what we did. But right now, I think what I'm raising for all of us is this challenge that networks of providers only work if someone wants to engage and has the trust in systems or individuals to go out and do that. So as we're talking about building networks, I would love to also ask us to talk about how do we build that trust and engagement.
I'd love to add on to that, if that's okay. So within working in a first responder-based program, we have a lot of difficulty getting buy-in for various reasons, whether social or just historical mistrust. And one of the biggest hurdles we have is getting buy-in from the schools. We're going into these schools that already have their kind of previously established threat assessment teams, but we're going in from a different lens. And even though we're this pre-criminal intervention, that law enforcement presence is still very powerful and very scary for a lot of people. And I'll keep talking about Sammy. I'm sorry, Sammy, but Sammy, love you, I miss you. Having that presence and having it be Sammy was very helpful of kind of establishing the program from the ground roots there. But it took face-to-face intervention, or not even intervention, but it's face-to-face contact, explaining what are our roles, why are we there, what support can we actually give you. And it took a long time, and a lot of the barriers that we see as a mental health professional, what are we all scared of? HIPAA, and going against HIPAA and getting grieved because of a HIPAA violation, and the schools have FERPA. So it's just a very scary space to share information often. And what we found to be super helpful was having printed materials from the Kane Institute about how to share information and what's permissible to share. So that buy-in piece is huge in the transferring of information. It's really scary for a lot of people. We're often more apt to protect that information rather than share it. And what we're finding is, you all know, we're often really hindering a process of the ability to intervene or have that early intervention ability if we don't share that information ahead of time. So I think that's a really important topic to bring up, and it's definitely been a difficulty for us as well. And we maybe just recently got over that hurdle of being able to do that.
I think you're making me a little nervous because our most recent CDP grant is to expand it for school districts instead of grants that have been paid to feed into our, to relate to our program. So I think we're going to encounter some of those challenges. And I'm just going to say, I think one of the main challenges is that we call these teams threat assessment teams. And if I have 3 kids, I would love them to get support, but would not love them to be reviewed by a threat assessment team if they needed something. So, and a related project funded out of DHS research with Steve Wine, where we're also looking at barriers and facilitators in schools to setting up threat assessment teams or other approaches to preventing violence. And really, I have to say, we're going in without kind of agnostic, like, I don't know that this is the best answer. I feel like I need to hear from schools about whether this could be done in a way that is understood as, not feeding into bias and pipeline prison problems, that it can be done in a way that is perceived as supportive to students. So we're in the questioning part of that journey. And I'm excited to hear that you feel like you've made some headway. And I'd love to know, like, well, I'll pass this, but I also want to know what shifted. Like, was there something you did that helped to build that trust and engagement?
Why don't you go? Because you're passing it, and I'll go after you.
Honestly, a big part of it was just that face-to-face contact and showing, hey, we're not here to come and arrest this kid. Now, parents, of course, they're going to be, if your kid came home and was like, hey, mom, a police officer talking today, you'd probably be very concerned, and rightfully so. And so a lot of times it was bringing the parent into those conversations too, and just showing the school that we're here to collaborate, we're not here to dominate. But the major shift was, and what we noticed, hey, this is working, is they started calling us for referrals and calling us to bring us into those threat assessments, because before it was like, okay, this case got really scary and now we need law enforcement intervention. And the whole point of our program was pre-criminal intervention and connecting people with resources that are more supportive and community-based. And now we were getting them in the early stages where, hey, we're just now doing a threat assessment on the kid. Can you guys come in and kind of sit through it and help start creating management plans with us? And so that was kind of our big aha moment of, wow, we did it. But I will say it's very doable. It will happen, but I think one of the main barriers we have is that we were law enforcement based in our model. So having that presence there was initially the biggest barrier for us. But as always, information sharing is hard. But for us, having that information to just hand to them, print it out, was huge, and really contributed to the ability to get information early on.
Yeah, so one thing that we heard from stakeholders in Hawaii when we started pushing threat assessment teams, we actually had stakeholders say, well, does this mean that this is only good for situations where there's a threat? And the implication is that there's a threat, there's already criminal activity afoot. And so one thing that we did was we went with the term behavioral intervention threat assessment management team. And that helped because a lot of the school professionals and other mental health professionals out in the community, including probation or referral services, are familiar with intervention. And so then that kind of helped shape the narrative. And then it's interesting how you were saying sometimes schools especially were afraid to engage because does this mean that law enforcement is being involved with our child automatically? It's interesting in Hawaii with some of the different groups that I work with. Some of them have a very strong law enforcement presence, and some of them do not. And some of them have explicitly told me they would prefer not to have a strong law enforcement presence. And it can be a little bit difficult because of the nature of public safety and preventing this type of violence, but we found that sometimes people need a little bit of space and we have to concentrate our education and outreach efforts in a way that's palatable to people who don't always want the law enforcement nexus right away at the beginning. And so I know Ben's got something to say, but I'd also kind of be interested to hear what you think about that topic.
So as we built out our program, we kind of had two guiding principles, I would say. One was it's only going to work if we have a dedicated champion of the program, right? So we weren't going to dictate to the counties who got to be the champion of that program. The sheriff was the right person to do it, great. But if the county executive was the right person or the head of the local school district was the right person, that was fine from our perspective too. And the way we sort of try to facilitate that, help the counties maintain an open mind about who should be running the program, is we coordinated our communications through the county executive. This has the potential for a little bit of political blowback because in most counties there are two county-wide elected officials, the county executive and sheriff. But our experience has been everybody's working together really well. The sheriff that wanted the program have with the blessing of the county executive, county mental health coordinator, the local school districts, with the understanding, as far as I can tell at this point, that their objective is not incarceration, right? Their objective is really to take a restorative approach, and you can say have resources that can help facilitate that. They're in a good position when we start. But in many other counties, we've seen totally separate actors be the focal point. Some it's been the county emergency manager, in others it's been the county mental health commissioner. So, we try to maintain diversity of sort of perspective and encourage the counties to initiate whatever program works best for them. But we've gotten a lot of positive feedback with the messaging that this should really be restorative and not law enforcement exclusive, from the law enforcement partners we've had and from the other folks who've been working on
it. So with these guys, is it possible to share some specific examples in communities that have worked, that the actual programs themselves? So for the audience, for folks online, if there's something you could share in response. I knew you were going to have.
So my whole work is mostly the direct intervention piece, and now I oversee it, so I'm just more of a glorified secretary. But Sammy and I do have some really great examples of when this worked really well, and just kind of the community all coming together to support this one person and potentially averting an attack. We had one individual, and Sammy will know exactly what I'm talking about, who was just very isolated from the society, lots of trauma in his history, was a foster child who was later adopted, and he really struggled. And we got that referral from the school initially. So this is one of the earlier cases that we had, and so we saw those barriers. Like, I don't know if I really want you here. And we just kind of sat back and watched, instead of trying to take over and dominate, but we just watched their process. And in the end, let them ask us questions, and in turn, us asking them questions. So there was this dialogue between the schools and our program
But with that, we determined all of these different supportive measures that could be put in place for the kid to make him much more successful, not only in his personal life, but within his schooling and things like that. And so it was connecting him to mentorship programs and different community groups that maybe were his own cultural background, but maybe other cultural backgrounds as well, to develop some empathy there for those different groups. But it was all of these different community groups working together to really support this child and get him to a place where he was moved off of that pathway to violence, and he no longer had those thoughts of wanting to harm others and things like that. But it was really interesting to see the whole community from all of these different backgrounds and different disciplines that often have kind of clashing views or ways of problem solving work together.
I don't want to take credit for other people's work. I consider myself a facilitator and a frontline actor in the space. But one of the big conversations we've been having is how do you track success? And from our perspective, and this is based in large part on the conversations we've had with Rock Tech, tracking interventions and whether or not those people were on that path. Like, obviously, we can't say definitively whether any of them were going to be a mass shooter, we're going to engage in acts of mass violence, but what we can say with fair amount of certainty in a lot of those cases, that this was somebody who was on that path and we had an opportunity to intervene and get them on a better path. So I understand that's kind of a much broader answer to your question, but I think it's important as we talk about success stories to understand what success will look like. It's not necessarily just stopping like your next school shooter. It really has to be about bringing somebody who's out of the fold back in the fold and helping them engage society.
And I think I think that's a greater question too, of how do you even define success in this space? And I think most of us have asked ourselves that question. And I think within our program, that's kind of the main struggle, because right now we're in a world of statistics and data mean the most rather than the stories. And so it's being able to provide the stories that actually give the context to the data and the numbers, because it's really hard to find what those numbers are in the space. Because how do you know that that person wouldn't back out of their plan on their own? So it's been really difficult. And I think looking at the broader topic of this panel is the outreach and the connection building. Having all of these different connections within our space, having a higher ed person, having someone from the school system, having someone from community mental health has been huge whenever we're looking for creative, supportive ways of diverting someone off of that pathway to violence. We've connected someone to a culinary school, and that ended up being what worked for them. We connected people to art programs, and so making all of these connections within your community, even if they don't seem necessarily directly connected to violence prevention, it's interesting to see how that works for just different individuals that we deal with.
A little bit of a different success story. I was talking to some folks over lunch. Thank you so much to those of you on the de-radicalization table. It was really great hearing from you. And one of the topics that came up was misinformation, disinformation, malinformation. So I have a little bit of a story about success at the community level, not just the individual level. What had happened in Hawaii was that we had a couple of cases where we heard about threats or disinformation regarding the LGBTQ community, specifically regarding some drag queen events. And we heard a couple of these incidents happen, and so we did, what fusion centers do, and kind of research the issue, see what else is going on in the country and elsewhere, and kind of spotted a pattern. And what we did was we took it to one of our statewide threat assessment teams. It sounds weird, it's directly you, deals mainly with cases involving education, but we took the issue to them, briefed them on it, and what happened from that was we were able to take all of the resources from the people who were a member of that team. So we had counselors, we had administrators, we had Title IX individuals who are able to kind of come up with a combined response to this disinformation about people being groomers. because we had all these experts in education who deal with children, deal with counseling, know victim advocacy, who all know that this is disinformation, that such and such people are groomers. We were able to take all of these different people with all of these different backgrounds and are preparing messaging and programming and presentations that we can take across all the islands, leveraging the people on the statewide team to go in and help correct that disinformation. And so while that's not a case of individual disruption, it's an example of how a whole community approach can come together just facing a generalized threat or a general safety issue.
I'm gonna stay at that sort of community team level, but first I'm gonna geek out, and then I'll get back to sort of more accessible conversation. So Wooten is a researcher who's done some thinking about how to evaluate multidisciplinary teams in other contexts, not in this one. But what he talks about that I think is really, really interesting is, okay, on one axis you have outcomes at the individual level. Of course, we want to get there. We want to know, does this help at the individual level? But then there's this other axis around team process. And if you're earlier in your development of a multidisciplinary team, you might need to be doing more thinking around, well, how is the team operating? And is there trust within the team? And what do those conversations look like? You know, in an ideal world, you're going to be out that far upper right quadrant where you have an individual outcomes and team process, but it's sometimes an evolution to get there. So harkening back to when we first started our pilot program, which is called Community Connect, it's evolved a bit over time, but at that moment we were standing something up from zero. There was nothing. And so our first path was to my colleague Saida Abdi, and I decided we just pretty much invite anyone we knew who was willing to come into the room and talk to us from various disciplines to see if, you know, do we have some meeting of the minds around unmet needs of youth? And in that first meeting, it was pre-COVID, we were like really packed into this room, stinky, stuffy room, and there was a community partner named Naima Agla, who I love dearly and I've worked with for many years, and we had someone from the JTTF, and we started talking about this, and Saida's phone was like blowing up with text from Naima, who's like, why is she here? What are we doing in the room together? Like, why are we here? Our kids are not terrorists. And so we got through the sort of tense first meeting, and there was enough agreement that there were some unmet needs that a number of people decided to continue to work together. And what we did over time as we started to convene is that we rotated through the team so that different partners could talk about what they did, what their mission was about, how they operated, the language they used for things, because when you do multidisciplinary work, you realize like when one person says intervention, it doesn't mean the same thing as when another person says intervention. We did this cross training, and we also started, what happened was what I call building trust through action, because before we even got to our first meeting, one of the team members reached out to this scheduling email that I sent to say, hey, I need some help on a case that I have, and got a consult. And then a second person reached out to this email group and asked for a consult. And then we were sitting in this room, having started to build a sense of relationship, having started to see how we were working to help kids, and law enforcement was actually working to not arrest kids, and that's why they were asking for help. And Naima said, I need help on a case. And she brought to the team a youth who had been really struggling and she was worried about, and we were able to help sort of help that youth re-engage in some more supportive mechanisms and services. So my answer in success story is like, I think we need to be thinking about that process. And that moment for me, when Naima went from sending the text message saying, why are we in the room together, to saying, actually, could we work together to help a kid? That was my marker of success.
Thank you. Thank you. So we want to open it up for questions for folks here. So please, if there are some, I see some folks getting up, that's good. But also if there's any online as well. Neil, I'm guessing you got
You hear and see me? Excellent. Well, first off, thank you guys so much for taking the time to do this. I guess a question more so directed towards Courtney and Ben as not only a first responder, but someone who works in state government. Are there any practices that you have found to be successful with not only advocating for state governments to allocate resources to these programs, but also practices that have been useful in operationalizing it from the federal to the state to the local level?
Do you start since you're at the state level?
So I don't want to try to put a positive spin on the Buffalo shooting, but sort of ones that happen, financial resources were made available. And what we've done is provide grants to counties to help stand up their TAM teams and to help develop their domestic terrorism plans. I think what we've done on the ground level that's not expensive and has been really helpful is bring in as many experts as we can to provide training. So we work with an organization called At Risk to provide like 2-day seminars on how to stand up a TAM team. We brought in the TAM teams that already exist in the state to talk to other counties that are interested in creating them. And over the course of the next year, our plan is to bring in our federal partners, potentially nonprofits, to provide trainings that will help them go forward. So, for example, the HIPAA issue that you mentioned is something that's come up repeatedly. Counties wanting to develop their own threat assessment experts, making sure that they are getting state-of-the-art training. And one thing I'll say, one of the things that gives me concern is there are some number of snake oil salesmen in this space. And so making sure that we are coordinating with the experts in the field, or folks here, vetting those vendors and bringing them in ourselves has been constructive, and working closely with the federal government to bring in their trainers has been good.
So we started off on grant funding. We used the BJA DMHCP grant that happened. And so with that, we were kind of in the phase of having to prove ourselves. And some of that was bringing in those free trainings and utilizing the Colorado Information Analysis Center or the Fusion Center to be able to bring those trainings to us and build our professional network to show, hey, look, we are actually making a difference. And this kind of goes back to what we had mentioned earlier about how do you even define success? How do you even show the numbers for this? And we recently removed city funding this past year, which is a huge success for us after being grant funded for so long. But one of the main motivating factors was actually a certain case where the threat was toward our city council. So there was a bit of a personal feeling there, and unfortunately, sometimes that's what it takes. When you're in local government, you got to show them why it's important to them. And you think in a place like Florida, where we had the theater shooting, and Colorado in general, where we've had so many unfortunate attacks, that you wouldn't have to prove that, but often you do. So it's not the best answer, but unfortunately, our pivotal moment was what actually impacted the individuals who made the decisions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question.
Sorry, I just have a quick question. You all brought up really great examples of how we've gotten better at doing threat assessment and risk assessment, all this different types of assessment that will inform intervention, excuse me. But I guess one of the things that it seems hasn't really progressed enough and hadn't got better enough has been the management piece, right? And I've heard you all talk about that. And one of the things that I've noticed both in the field, but also talking to other folks and supporting other teams is that, you know, you all talk so much about how you build relationships and partnerships, but it's that sustainability piece to that relationship or that partnership and how that continues after initial engagement. One of the biggest places for fall off is management piece. So when you're an agency that's partnering with someone, if you don't communicate to them sort of what your limitations are from a management standpoint, there's a lack of communication. I've seen relationships end that way. And I've also seen some agencies and organizations not really be partnerships because they're so extractive when it comes to information sharing and they don't really give anything back. So I would love if you all in your different roles can talk about what it looks like to sustain a relationship or a partnership so they can understand some of those difficulties in crisis moments and how you actually make it a relationship where it's a two-way street.
Thank you so much for your question. Did this turn off? You turned it off. Okay. Thank you so much for your question. I feel really strongly about that. Thank you for bringing it up. I think one of the best ways to do it is be honest about who you are, where you're coming from, and why you're there, and why you value the partner. Because like you said, a lot of emphasis on identification and assessment, and then some people just, they cut out. They're like, okay, we're done. And that's not acceptable. And so acknowledging that different participants have different roles, and then giving the people who do the best job of management, which is you folks in the room, but the social service providers, mental health workers, educators, giving those people leadership roles. And saying when you have cases, turning them over to those people, if you do not belong to an agency that is going to manage the case, you develop really strong relationships with the people who will manage the case, and you keep giving them resources, you keep sending them to training, you keep spending your money and your time on supporting those people, and you get them to also start supporting each other. So thank you so much for bringing that up. See, you folks do more management, right? Because you have teams. All right. Did you want to give a different perspective?
Well, so yes, our team is focused on management, connected to the mass-based threat assessment team. But that team also has adults that go through the team, and so they don't come to us. We're kind of a nice, handy, built-in management team with a pretty well-established partnership. Even then, I would say there's still room for hiccups. We need to. There's times they wish we could give more information than we can. There's times we wish the FBI could give more information than they can. So there's still a navigation, and my answer to that is you just got to be as true as you can to your professional principles and genuine human being with the other person and understand their discipline. But what the mass-based threat assessment team under Sarah Wheelan's guidance has done, which I think is really wonderful, is that they now at the end of assessing a case identify a management team. And they are specific about who's on that. That team then convenes outside of the threat assessment team meeting. They're charged with sort of figuring out how to make real the ideas that have been talked about in the threat assessment team meeting. And then on a quarterly basis, they're scheduled to come back and share out, not just like, yeah, you've done it all, but if there's some challenges, that kind of goes back to the team then to figure out like, okay, we had a great idea, it didn't play out, what do we do with it now? That's sort of a newer idea that team is implementing, but I'm excited about it.
Not to get too touchy-feely, but I found that honestly approaching the relationships with a lot of humility has been very constructive. Making clear that I don't know everything because the state owns some it's not my paycheck as opposed to whoever's signing our local partner's paycheck. It's been a really good way to build trust with them. We make sure it's a dialogue, it's never us dictating. And I think through that, we've been able to bring the resources they've asked for. The more resources we bring, the more they trust us. Obviously, you've got to be aware of what they're asking for. You have to vet these things. It has to be in line with policy initiative you're putting forward. But ultimately, treating everybody in the room like an equal partner has gone a long way towards building constructive relationships on our end.
So in addition to our city funding, we're actually a PPP grantee as well. And with that, we're bringing on a case manager that's specific to our PPP program in addition to our case manager for our crisis response team. So this person is going to be responsible for kind of facilitating all of the different aspects of the individual. Whenever we make a management plan on our team, we're identifying every single system that person operates within, whether that's the school system, higher education, work, the medical system, you name it. We're trying to bring in a representative from every single one of those. It's similar. Who has kids in the room? Probably many of you. If you're trying to implement some form of discipline, but maybe your partner or your co-parent does not, it's not very effective, right? So it's very similar in the threat management space we find. To have a more robust plan and have a more effective plan, everyone needs to be enforcing the same expectations. So with our case manager role that we'll be bringing in, they'll be responsible for gathering all of those individuals and bringing them all to the table. Because the more eyes we have on someone, the less likely it is that that person will fall through the cracks. Because Sammy, you're exactly right. People fall through the cracks in the management phase. Everyone's so excited about the assessment part and saying, oh yeah, they're bad, okay, well now what? So by having that role, assigning just different tasks and different management styles to that individual and making sure that those expectations are clear, as well as having regular meetings and staffings for that individual to ensure that that plan is being upheld.
I think there are a couple, there we go.
Hi, my name is Mia. I'm from Georgia State. I know many of you, so let me start by saying thank you. This is really loud. I think that's, as you guys move forward with looking at threat assessment, one of the things that keeps peeking at my brain is that we know that the base rate between people who are either engaged in this content, either posting content, consuming content, to the transcendence to actually engaging in violence is extraordinarily low. If Mark's statement is to be believed, it's 0.5%. So I think when you're looking at threat assessment, we need to have this like reminder that we're dealing with a really, really small number of people that are going from radical idea to radical action. All the echo. The second thing is, and this is not specifically to the panel, but for today generally, is we seem to be conflating radicalization, poverty, lack of education opportunities. And I don't know if that's necessarily true for all the groups, because we know with the jihadi groups, they are higher educated, wealthier.
About education and poverty, are not correlated, and they might even be inversely correlated with some of the radical groups. So it might be true of the far right and less true of jihadis, and we do not know about the economic anxiety argument of the far right. So those are the two things, and I apologize for that crazy echo. But I did want to talk about or at least push you on base rate, because it's very possible that the intervention that you guys are doing are going to hit a very large population. It's still good, but I don't necessarily think it's preventing radical action at the same level as just doing something good for society.
Would like to go.
Just, if you can, just do like a brief summary of what you think she's asking.
Okay, I think Mia is asking, the base rate is so low. Is any of this actually preventing radical violence? That was the question I was going to respond to anyway. And I am not shy of being a proponent for like preschool prevention. We need to be starting early, and we need to be broad. We also need to be thinking about what to do if there's someone progressing further down the line. So I'm not shy about saying it's okay to wrap in a lot of good work in the course of having threat assessment and management teams. That is, however, where I start worrying again about the name threat assessment team, because I don't want a preschooler run through a threat assessment team. I want them to run through something that is not going to stigmatize them, and that instead is focused on sort of that health and wellness that is appropriate developmentally for us to be thinking about at that stage, and I would argue appropriate all the way along. So I will answer you with that, Mia.
Yeah, you're totally right. Is that the base rate is so low, the risk is so high, which I think is why this gets so much attention, right? It's all over the news. But the question then comes up, okay, so why are you doing a whole lot of this work and putting a heck of a lot of resources towards that? And that's why, like when Heidi said, we can't just think of threat assessment. We think of kind of a holistic approach. Like we were talking about social workers earlier, thinking as a system. This is the same thing. I agree that in some cases, everything that we do isn't always tailored to that big school shooter or that big movie theater bomber, but it is tailored towards helping the individuals. And especially when we talk about things like what you brought up about how we can't have stereotypes about education, et cetera, and violent extremism, the more that we wrap in the community and the actual providers who do the work, the more we trust those people to recognize when is this a holistic need and what is the specific need of the individual involved.
Sorry, not excited about this question. And I remember back like 15 years ago, there was some American Society of Public Health meeting with like a handful of people around this new issue of violent extremism and could there be a public health approach to it? And Benjamin George, I think, was the head of the American Public Health Association at the time. And he stood up and he said at the end of the meeting, but if you really want to prevent violence, you should really look into reducing lead exposure. And it was sort of this like bomb that dropped on the whole room because there were all these people galvanized around this specific issue. And he was totally right. Like actually reducing lead exposure was going to do more in terms of preventing violence than, capturing 1 or 2 or 3 cases down the road. However, that doesn't mean you don't also need to have something in place to prevent something that is someone who might be moving down that pathway towards violence. So to circle back though, that's why this needs to be a whole society approach. That's why it needs to be interagency. That shouldn't just be held by security services. We need to see SAMHSA stepping into the conversation. We need to see C stepping into the conversation. So the Department of Education, this needs to be whole of society and interagency for us to really be able to address the needs across this lifespan.
Okay, I think at 30 seconds. I agree with everything that was just said, but from a purely operational perspective, I'll give a different point, which is that when you look at the cost of recovery from your standard mass shooting situation, you're running into tens if not hundreds of millions of dollars. And so in terms of rationalizing funding that we're putting towards this and the energy we're putting into it, these things pay for themselves, even if only 1 in 100 people that come into contact with them are actually a potential mass shooter, right? And then the ancillary benefit is everybody else who had access to the services that need it, but wasn't necessarily going to be mass shooter.
And that's a good wrap up. Thank you all. I saw there were more questions. I've got more questions myself, but please feel free to reach out to everybody here and talk. And thank you.